Um, Thank you, everyone, for coming along to this very late change of speaker talk. It's magnificent to see so many people here for our first one for the year. This is our 22nd Grassy Talk, which is kind of exciting that these keep going. Do tell me if the captioning is irritating and spoiling your experience. I've never used it before. So before we go any further, I should please pay my respects to First Nations elders across Victoria. I'm speaking from the land of the Wurundjeri, but in GPN to date has been on Wurundjeri, Bunurong and Wadawurrung land. So I've always paid respects to them. But these days, I realise we have a far more Victoria-wide remit. So really respect to all Victorian elders, past and present, and sincere apologies for the extent to which us post-colonial settlers have managed to trash everything so comprehensively, and hopefully through events like this we can at least progress a little bit in making things better. Tonight we're very fortunate to have John Morgan step into the breach. He is my knight in grassy armour for agreeing literally at almost the last minute to do this talk. It's John is, of course, very well respected grassland ecologist in Australia. He's co-editor-in-chief of the journal Botany, and he has a whole lot of other credits to his name as well, and he's an associate professor at La Trobe University. So without further ado, I'll hand over to John and we can see what the future holds for us.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks everyone for making it tonight. And I'm sorry that it was a last-minute change. I was actually going to turn up tonight and listen to Josh. So yeah, we've flipped it 180 degrees, but that's okay. Adrian just panically said this morning about 8:30 this morning, I don't suppose you could give a talk. And so I'm rehashing some stuff that some of you might have seen before, and I apologise for that, but I didn't really have time to do anything else. But what I hope to do tonight is to get you thinking. I always like to get people thinking about grasslands, and I'm going to get you to think about the future. So I'll share my screen, Adrian, and we will get going. So more than happy to answer questions later on once we get going, or once I finish even, but happy if you put up some questions in the chat. So looking to the future, and I think we should always look to the future because that's what we can influence. But to look to the future, we have to look to the past a little bit to understand what needs to be done. So we're really lucky in Australia. We live in what is a grassy biome. If you think continentally, we tend to think of Australia as about gum trees and wattles, and it certainly is. But we're lucky enough to live in an ecosystem type of biome, a grassland ecosystem that's really extensive. You can see from this figure here in yellow, that's the inland Mitchell grasslands. Now, just about none of us would have ever seen those, and that's a tragedy because they're magnificently extensive ecosystems, not particularly rich in species, but just on the scale, they're amazing. And they're the heart of the pastoral industry in sort of Western Queensland. If we sort of zoom in a little bit, we just come a bit further down to the east, we've got the Darling Downs. The Darling Downs to the west of Brisbane and north is almost in an even worse state than the Victorian volcanic plains. It's all soybeans on beautiful black volcanic soils, and they're a little bit lucky. They just have some topography. So stony rises are literally the only place where the original ecosystem persists. And down here in southeastern Australia, we've got the temperate grasslands, one of the most magnificent ecosystem types in Australia, again, for their extensiveness, their diversity, and the stories that they tell and link us to the past. So we're going to exclusively talk about those type of ecosystems in the red tonight. These are what we call the temperate grasslands. They're typically dominated by things such as kangaroo grass, but a bit further north, they'll be dominated by spear grasses and other warm season grasses that grow in slightly drier environments. And for most of us, this is the ecosystem that we're most familiar with. And so it's good for us to focus on that. But what we're going to talk about today actually has relevance in other parts of Australia. One of the reasons we have such extensive grasslands all over Australia, certainly the eastern half of Australia, is they're on good soils. So in our part of the world, that's the volcanic soils that stretch from Melbourne all the way west, out past Dunkeld and past Hamilton. To the north of us, they're the extensive alluvial plains of the Murrumbidgee-Darling systems that have flooded historically over a long period of time, deposited, fertile soils. Further north, the Darling Downs, as I said, that's also a volcanic, black volcanic soils that are just amazingly rich in an Australian context. And the Mitchell grasslands are again floodplain grasslands. So wherever we get fertility, represented here pretty much by red in a spectral image from a satellite, we get grasslands. And so you might be able to pick out around Canberra, the Monero, down in East Gippsland, you'll have the Gippsland Plains, the extensive Victorian volcanic plains. To the north of us, the Murray Riverine Plains and the Wimmera Plains a little bit to the west of that. That's the pre-European extent of these ecosystems that are largely a consequence of fertile soils. So of course, and you don't need me to tell you this, there's a collision with European agriculture. When Europeans first came to Australia and they usurped Aboriginal people, what they really were eyeing off was these productive soils. It's no surprise that the Grampians and the Little Desert National Parks, which have been on fire, unfortunately, this last few weeks, they were the bits that no one wanted because they were on infertile soils, rocky landscapes full of shrubs that A, cattle won't eat, and B, you can't really grow crops there. So the grasslands were really targeted heavily by European settlers. This is a very famous painting by John Glover from a location in Tasmania, and it just paints this picture of prosperity, extensive grass, which, equates to, fattening cows and being able to grow crops. And so this pattern repeats itself all over the grasslands of temperate Australia and again, going further north. And it's ingrained. Glover painted this picture in part so that those back in Europe could see what they should be coming out to achieve, to prosperity. Of course, Glover wasn't the only one. Eugène von Gerard, of course, very famous for lots and lots of paintings that he did in the early times around the Western, the Western Plains, Victorian volcanic plains. Again, extensive landscapes of grass interspersed with trees, and people like Mitchell oversaw basically the collapse of this ecosystem. I'd like to remind people that before there was a gold rush in Victoria, there was a grass rush. This country was occupied within a few years of European settlement. In fact, as you would probably be aware, some people were here before Mitchell even knew they were here, the Henty brothers that came across to Portland. So there was a grass rush, unregulated land use and, absolutely, putting European agricultural practices onto an ecosystem that just had never seen anything like this before. Now, that's the context. We know that's our context, and that's led to shocking degradation, shocking loss of an entire biome. A couple of extra photos just to sort of reiterate that this transformation happened so early. So when we're here in 2025 talking about this, we need to go back in time. And this is down at Balmoral, which is not strictly a grassland region, but I like showing some old photos from Balmoral because it shows on the left by 1966, extensive clearing. 1912, oats were grown in formerly red gum woodlands, dead trees, oats as tall as the man by the looks of it. And look at that horse and cart, that's pulling out wattle bark for the tanning industry. So fantastic transformation of a landscape within 60 to 80 years of European settlement. And so we've been chasing our tail ever since with grassland conservation because we've been left with the skerricks that we have behind and having to work out how do we conserve an ecosystem from this context. So if we were to do this all again, we'd probably do it a bit differently. And it's why I'm so concerned about the northern tropical savannas, unregulated land use as it were, and land transformation happening. We should learn from what happened in the south of Australia and sort of design landscapes a bit better as we go forth. But that's a different story for another day. So our starting point is grasslands have been exploited like no other ecosystem in Australia because of this link to the fertile soils. And yet a whole bunch of people come along and want to conserve this ecosystem. So we have to be a little bit realistic about the challenges that entails. It's much, much easier to do this in other ecosystems that haven't been exploited nearly as much. For many of you, you'd be aware that the Victorian volcanic plains bioregion, grasslands have been reduced by an enormous extent. You know, whether that's 99%, 99.5%, it doesn't really matter. We've lost ostensibly all of the ecosystem from across its range, except for, interestingly, quite a few larger blocks of grasslands close to Melbourne where we have opportunities to manage those. But if we went back in time, we would want to try and contain more of this ecosystem in conservation reserves. We don't have that option. Despite that enormous transformation, if you think about how many plant species have been lost from the Victorian volcanic plain, like completely lost, it's actually sort of interesting. We haven't lost any species entirely from like existence, you know, from planet Earth. Diurus fragrantissima, the white diurus, is about the closest thing we have got to that, in the sense of we reduced a species that's endemic to this part of the world and we're down to very few individuals in the wild. And lots of people have been working to enhance the conservation of that species. We have lost at least 2 species from the Victorian volcanic plains, at least 2, and I'm happy to hear about others. But those species occur elsewhere in grassland bioregions or grassland regions Victoria. So Thesium australe, from memory, a parasitic plant, still persists in Gippsland, the Gippsland high sort of montane grasslands. Euphrasia scabra, which was also a parasitic plant, the VVP has been lost from the VVP completely, and it's now confined to this particular species, a few populations in, again, in montane kind of region, grasslands and grassy ecosystems in Gippsland. So despite this massive transformation, we still have an opportunity to conserve most of the species. I find that remarkable. And it's at this point in time, we have to get serious about conservation of grasslands. Not saying we haven't been, but there's only so long we can continue to, you know, see degradation of grasslands and loss of grassland species. Why this is a problem, my PhD student at the time, Ben Zeman, who I think's in the audience tonight, Ben did some work a few years ago looking at urban grasslands, just if we constrain ourselves to near Melbourne. So in Wyndham, Hume, Brimbank, those kind of local government areas. And Ben went studiously around to a whole bunch of sites here in yellow and did species lists at each of these sites, just for plants. Again, mostly we're talking about plants because they're there to be counted. They're easier to find than many of the animals. And what Ben found was a lot of sites didn't have that many native species in them. They would have kangaroo grass. They might have some resilient grassland herbs, maybe some blushing bindweed, maybe some eryngium, the blue devil, if we're lucky, and some spear grasses and things. So a lot of sites had very little diversity in them. And often that's because they were small, but they'd lost a lot of their diversity. Relatively few sites represented, so the number of sites occupied on the y-axis there, relatively few sites were diverse. So I want you to think about places you might know, perhaps Truganina Cemetery or Evan Street grassland, those kind of places that support lots and lots of species. And they tend to have lots of uncommon and rare species like the button wrinklewort or perhaps the sunshine diurus. What this means is that many grasslands around Melbourne don't actually support much of the grassland diversity at all. And so that's a problem because we have very few sites that contain a lot of the diversity. We've got to make sure that we know which sites they are and we manage them appropriately to maintain and even enhance their diversity. But that gives us a challenge looking forward. What do we do with all these sites that don't have much diversity? I think that's a great opportunity to enhance their diversity, to get really proactive about enhancement of grasslands, not just preservation. Now, one of the reasons a lot of these sites don't have many species in them is because when you take large grasslands like this beautiful example here and you start making them smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, of course, you therefore sample, or you can have fewer species in those remnants. And so we have lots and lots and lots and lots of little remnant grasslands that are small in area that don't have many species. That doesn't mean they're not good quality. They just can't support very many species because they're too small. Or the populations of the plants in those little remnants are so small that they blink out over time and we lose diversity. So there's sort of two things going on, really. So it's our job, if we want to conserve grasslands, is to think about this context. How do we get things back into grasslands, and where should we do that? And how, of course. Now, I show this graph over and over. This was some work that was done probably 10 years ago now by what was called the Australian Research Centre for Urban Ecology. And it's a little bit of ecology around species persistence. So let's just work through this graph here. On the x-axis, we've got the proportion of native vegetation. So think about, before European people came, we had 100% native vegetation. Hence, we've got 100% of species. So if you like, species persistence is 100%. That y-axis is a percentage, if you like. As you lose native vegetation, typically what happens is, obviously, you lose the number of species that can persist in it, but it's not linear. So you can see if we lose 50% of vegetation, theoretically, we can still support about 80% of species. If we lose 80% of species, we've only got 20% left, so 80% of the vegetation, we can still support about 60%. It's only once we get to this really dire sort of state here of very little habitat that we're going to lose a lot of species. And what they did at Melbourne University in this research group is they went around to a whole bunch of cities in Australia, or harness data at least, from what we might call New World cities, cities that have only been 100, 200 years old. And they compared that to old cities in Europe that have been around for hundreds of years, so like Berlin and Paris, places like that. And they found out what actually was the relationship between loss of vegetation and how many species persisted. So the black triangles are the New World cities: Canberra, Adelaide, Melbourne, places like that. And what you can see is, despite losing almost all the native vegetation, most native plant species were still persisting. The old world cities in the crosses are hundreds of years old. I can't remember the actual cutoff date. Let's call them 400 to 500-year-old cities. And you can see they're mostly sitting above that line still, that theoretical line of how many species should be present. So there's still, it says, species can hang on for a long time before they go extinct, despite the fact they've lost most of their habitat. Now, Melbourne happens to be that bloody triangle right there. We've lost most of our habitat, and yet we still have most of our species. And if you just look at the difference between where we currently sit and where the line is, if you like, how many species we should have, that's called the extinction debt. Species that are predicted to go extinct because they don't have any habitat to live in anymore, pretty much. For Melbourne, they were calculating that 528 species are predicted to be lost in the future simply because we don't have any habitat for them. And a lot of this will be because of the grasslands. So we can look at that two ways. Gee whiz, that's bad news. Or we can look at that and say, hey, we've got the opportunity to actually reverse that decline, if you like, of habitat, of species loss. So I like to call that, we've got temporal resistance. But time, has meant that not, all these species haven't been lost yet. We've got some resistance to loss. So it's our job from today onwards to say, how do we stop that red arrow line eventuating? How do we minimize this? So currently, we're lucky. We haven't lost many species. That's not to say that in 100 years, we won't have lost an awful lot. So this is the warning call, of the past, as it were. And we're at the point of, well, what does that mean for the future? And that's what I wanted to use, the rest of the talk to really start thinking about. Now, one of the old mantras from grassland conservation biologists over the last 30 or 40 years is, if you want to save an ecosystem, you've got to save all the parts. So we're lucky. We've still got all the parts. In many respects, we're lucky we don't have to find the parts. They're all laid out for us. But my worry is that, well, I've still got all the parts. What are we going to do with them? Do we know what to do to put them back together, or how to make the engine run more efficiently, as it were? So that's what I want to focus on, is the future from this point on. So I'm going to introduce just a couple of topics around conservation and restoration. What should it look like? Some of it won't be any surprise to you. We've got to continue to protect those areas that we have also already protected. So that's ongoing management of those areas, but protect those ones still in need of protection. And the work that the Grassy Plains Network through Adrian's been doing has been amazing at trying to document, well, where are these sites? What's their current condition? Are they protected? Are they declining? So enhanced protection will only get us so far because there's only so little grassland out there to be protected. We've got to manage what we've got. So that might be through its fire regimes, it's through its weed spraying programs, it's through its educational programs, all that kind of stuff. We know that. There's nothing that we don't know. Excitingly, over the last 10 years, the work of Paul Gibson-Roy, that many of you might know, has been about reversing decline. So restoring grasslands, recreating, it's not actually restoring them, it's recreating them in places where they no longer exist. And I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about augmentation. I think this has fallen through the cracks. The idea that we've got lots of plants out there in these little populations that may well be just declining to local extinction, like just declining. We have an opportunity to augment populations, make them grow and become more viable than they currently are. And there's a big question around, well, how do we do that? Where do we do it? For what species? So we'll touch on that in a moment. So I want to start with, we can save all the parts, but I've often been sort of puzzled by saving all the parts for what purpose? Well, an ecosystem actually is the connection of parts. Pollinators, being drawn to flowers, they then pollinate them, they produce seeds, seeds get eaten by insects, insects get eaten by skinks, skinks get eaten by birds. We create an ecosystem. So I think we need to continue to push the idea that we're not just conserving the parts, we're actually trying to conserve some of the function of these grasslands. So a good place to start is to think about animals in grasslands. This is a fat-tailed dunner, awesome little creature. And I find these not that frequently, but enough to know they're still out in the plains grasslands on the Victorian volcanic plains. These guys are carnivores, and they're related to quolls and the Tasmanian devil, unbelievably. They must play a really important role in hoovering up, like this, the interaction of a predator in an ecosystem. Now they're pretty uncommon. So something's going on here. It's either this species is not supported, there's not enough resources in grasslands to support them, or there's something about the grassland that prohibits their persistence. That could be predation, that could be, who knows? There's a lot of things we don't know. But my point is here, these things must have played a really important role in grasslands. So if we take them out, what are we getting in its place? Well, we're getting invasive species, insects in particular, things like slugs, they're mollusks, that are moving into grasslands because there is no predation. Now, I don't know what we do about this, but it's really starting to think about what's a functioning grassland look like, not just a pretty looking grassland that's persisting. We can take this, I guess, a more obvious way is we've lost that whole digging fauna from most grasslands. They've been reintroduced back into Mount Rothwell, and it's amazing what's going on there. So there's lots and lots of evidence now, more for the arid part of Australia, about the role of bilbies, but we have the equivalents. We've got bandicoots, we had bedongs. They were digging, they were turning things over, they were probably creating soil health in the context of decomposition of soils. For the most part, we can't find these organisms in grasslands, but there's really good programs in place now where we're starting to enhance the populations of these things and seeing the really positive outcomes. We just need to go to Tasmania, the Midlands of Tasmania, where eastern barred bandicoots still persist, to see the amazing role they play on soil turnover. It must have been a really important process of renewal of grasslands, of regeneration, that we've not replaced with anything. So you go to Tasmania and you just see pits everywhere. So these become litter turnover sites. These become germination microsites. These become litter collection places. So you have different productivity. Now I'm just saying, what does a grassland look like if it has no animals in it? Can we replace this with our own perturbation of soils somehow? for most of us, we would steer away from that because soil disturbance tends to equate to weed invasion. But we've taken this enormous function out of grasslands and not replaced it. And we've also taken Indigenous populations, if we all know the stories about murnongs, the yam daisies, enormous soil digging would have been going on by Aboriginal women, harvesting, digging, planting, an amazing aspect of grasslands that just stopped literally overnight. And we've sort of not thought about it at all in terms of the importance for a functional grassland. Now, whether it's possible to replicate this, to enhance this somehow, I don't know, but it's the sort of thing we should be thinking about. And it's one of the reasons why the fenced plots like Mount Rothwell, tell us so much about grassland function in the presence of these organisms. It'd be great if we had opportunities in the new Western Grassland Reserve, for argument's sake, to get these organisms back into parts of that. So this is just a slide. I mean, this is in the central Australia, but this little pit here, we've got 3 acacias germinating. Like there is really strong evidence that the diggings of animals facilitate regeneration. And I think increasingly we've got grassland regeneration a little bit skew-if, maybe. So this is a grassland. It was drawn by a guy back in 1935 out near Rockbank. So it's a fantastic early insight into what grasslands look like. We've got kangaroo grass, tussocks, they're triandra. Got some other grasses, might be wallaby grasses or spear grasses. And we've got lots and lots of wildflowers in the inter-tussock spaces between the grasses. So it's clearly a diverse system, lots of individuals. This is a square yard, so 3 feet by 3 feet. So it's a pretty small little diagram here. Now, when we think about grassland function, we think, okay, if we burn grasslands, that checks the kangaroo grass, that allows the small herbs to regenerate or certainly to persist. So we tend to see recruitment through the lens of fire. When we burn a grassland, that's what allows things to germinate. But given a whole bunch of species probably were associated with diggings, that doesn't really, fire doesn't replace digging, really. It creates an opportunity for things to germinate, but it may not stimulate germination or bring soil up in the seed bank to the surface, to stimulate germination. We've tended to think about grasslands, and this is fine. This is the evolving understanding and thinking as consisting of very long-lived plants, which they do. They're perennial, and they don't need to recruit very often. But what we're seeing is that grassland populations are declining over time. And why is that? Could be poor management, but also because they're not getting those cues for germination or those microsites for germination that historically they would have. So I want us to think a little bit about that in the future. I'm just going to go off on a little one-slide diversion. Coming back to function. Function matters, but the EPBC Act doesn't look at this at all. A functional ecosystem has no place in legislation. Legislation is fundamentally mechanistic, meaning we list species as threatened as entities because there's very few of them left. We don't ever view them as part of a functioning ecosystem, and hence concepts such as web of life enhancing processes are absent from legislation. So we symptom chase. We keep running after things that get rarer and rarer without thinking about what's the role of these species in systems. We're getting better at that because we're starting to think about, well, what role do dingoes have in systems, or what role might bandicoots have in systems? I think we need to push this idea a little bit more into the future, that threatened species is super important, but we need to think about ecosystems as functional entities as well. So the interactions or interrelationships that run ecosystems and allow them to evolve, the legislation is silent on this. We're just about saving things on the brink of extinction. And that, I think, is leading to grassland decline. We're not thinking about the broader interactions of grasslands in some instances. So what's pollinating particular flowers? What's dispersing these things? I think we need to move beyond just the threatened entity itself and think about process. Some of you would have heard me talk about recovering woodies in grasslands. So grasslands are a slight misnomer, actually. For a long time, we would have thought they're just grasses out there and herbs and not much else. And so this beautiful scene just here is absolutely true for some parts of the VVP. But if we look back in time to 1852, out towards Challicum Hills, which is out near Ararat, right on the edge of the VVP, consistently we see trees. Now, those trees might be red gums around the edge of watercourses, which they might be there. But in other times, they seem to be on the rises of this extensive plain. This is a fantastic image that was drawn in 1852 in the Challicum sketchbook. You can see that houses are already there. There's heaps of sheep, there's holding pens, but there's this spectre of woody plants across the landscape. And they might be, if you, kind of imagine and squint your eyes and what have you, things like she oaks that are under the rises. And we've got these extensive plains. They're actually almost more like savannas. This entity in grasslands has been largely overlooked in the last 150 years. And hence, when we see little remnants like this is probably, I don't know what that is, this area potentially, maybe, on a stony rise. Rather than viewing that as potentially a really important remnant and an insight into the previous landscape, we tend to just sort of think of it as a curiosity. But there's enough evidence across the Victorian volcanic plain that there were very large, either small trees or very large shrubs. So this is Banksia marginata at Wandoo. That individual tree must be a couple of centuries old. It's not there by chance. It's on a rocky rise. Now, Banksias have largely disappeared from the grassland landscape, but thanks to people like the Friends of Forgotten Woodlands, working in harmony with people like Steve Sinclair at ARI and many others, we're starting to get a handle on, well, these are actually really important resources across the landscape. These were stepping stones of floral resource, stepping stones of nesting resource in a landscape that basically, is primarily grassy. But we've underplayed just how important woody plants were in this landscape. So there's a real push at the moment, I think it's a very good push, to rediscover the role of woody plants in this grassy ecosystem, the Banksias, the she oaks, the Busserias, things like that, the Hymenanthus or Melicitus. Lightwoods are another one, which are really right on the brink now because woody plants were harvested. There wasn't many woody plants out in this plains country. They were harvested. They were used either for fuel, I imagine. In some instances, they'd be used for furniture or for building materials. And hence, the pressure on this ecosystem was so extensive that we almost forgot that woody plants even existed. So I think there's a great opportunity to think about what do volcanic cones look like? Should they have woody plants on them? If we're going to restore them, maybe that's the opportunity, that's the vision to think about some of the volcanic craters around the place and what role do woody plants play. One of my hobby horses is to think about connectivity. We don't have too many options here anymore because most of the landscape's been disconnected. It's been cleared. But if you were to look in any textbook about how to restore a landscape, they would normally tell you to do these four things: expand the area of remnants, manage the habitat of remnants, good quality management, weed control, burning, whatever it might be, reduce the impacts from surrounding environments. So that could be fertilizer drift, that kind of thing. So the interface we're going to manage, but you would try and increase landscape connectivity because landscape connectivity is what allows gene flow through landscapes. So rather than having islands that are operating like islands, and we know a lot about islands, small islands don't support very many species because they're basically an island, you're trying to reconnect these landscapes. And that's really critical for gene flow, but also what's happening with climate is how do species move through this landscape? Or are we consigning them to doom, really, because we don't know how to get them through the landscape? It may be really hard for us to do this, but these are the hard decisions we have to make. So I work in landscape ecology. That's one of the kind of disciplines I work in. And there's really two interesting principles in landscape ecology that are very relevant to grassland aficionados. When you don't have much vegetation cover in a landscape, and the volcanic plains grasslands fit that perfectly, the configuration of your restoration, revegetation is really important, where you put it. But if you've got quite a lot of grassland left, and we might be now talking about the northern plains, the size of revegetation becomes much, much more important. So you want to increase the size of your remnants. We'd like to do that, on the VVP, but frankly, we're starting from a really low base. So in the landscape ecology principles, you'd be looking at connecting small bits to enhance their connectivity, to make them more functional, allowing pollinators to move, or animals to move, or pollen and seed to move through the landscape. If you're from northern Victoria, on the Northern Plains grasslands, or if you're lucky to be up in the Monero is a really good, there's lots of native grassland. If you want to see good grasslands, go to the Monero south of Canberra. It's fantastic grasslands. That would be about making more grassland, just getting bigger and bigger blocks, creating bigger habitat areas. But for us, it's about connectivity, and we need to probably wrestle with this idea. How can we connect landscapes? One of the big challenges is the context of our fantastic, nationally important grasslands. So most of our really high quality grasslands occur in cemeteries, on railway lines, and on roadsides that haven't been grazed, principally for the last 150 years very intensively. They might have even been burnt, so our linear reserves. But they're disconnected from one another. So in this landscape example that Ben Zeman provided me, here we've got two grasslands. They're really super high quality, both of them, but they're disconnected by phalaris, an exotic pasture grass. So it's pretty hostile for movement of animals and plants. They can't get between these two areas, despite the fact they might only be 400 metres apart. And this repeats itself over and over and over through the landscape. Good bits of grassland disconnected by poor bits of grassland. And hence, that has implications for movement of species. Like we kind of know this. And this is really well known from over in the prairies in the US that have very similar problems to us. And so we're learning from what they're learning, basically. So if you've got islands in a sea of agriculture, we know that small islands ultimately don't support many species. They just go extinct because the numbers are too small. You can't support enough individuals to support a population. But what if we were to connect these islands up through revegetation or restoration processes, so that not only you might double the area of your grassland, but you also now have the ability for species to move through more suitable habitat. Pretty radical thinking, but it's where we need to go. And we've now got techniques to do this because Paul Gibson-Roy's introduced ideas like scalping. And so here's some examples from down in Western Victoria near Dunkeld, where you just come along, you identify the bits that you want to protect. Isn't that fantastic on the right there? There's the kangaroo grass. And someone's basically identified there is a line where all the weeds start. Let's just take out the weeds. We scalp. We need seeds. This is going to be a recurring theme in the last 10 minutes of our talk. We can't do any of this without an investment in the future of seeds. They are the new plants for most species. If we don't have a seed industry or a seed resource, we can't restore, we can't regenerate. We need to get serious about this. And we're increasingly losing that opportunity as more and more remnants are lost or species are lost from remnants. And then we can get people like Dave Franklin, not to name drop, but Dave actually has a business called Grassland Flora that specialises in resowing native species back into these kind of environments. And he's got purpose-built or modified rather, sowing equipment, and he's got tractors, and they just come along and they drill seeds into the soil, and we can resow large areas in a very short amount of time, provided we've got enough seed. But the aim is then to create two excellent patches of grassland that are connected by a species, poor initially, native grassland, but it's native. And that will then hopefully create the conditions for recolonisation of species. And the work we've been doing in Western Victoria, this site right here, or one very near to it, now has striped legless lizards in it, only 2 to 3 years after it was sown. Oh, it's just great that they've gone from this to a functioning habitat. As I said, seeds are our best friends for grasslands. I can't emphasize enough that we won't save grasslands if we don't save seeds, to be used in ways that their effectiveness is maximized. One of the problems with direct seeding is you use a lot of seed, not much of it germinates successfully. We've got to get better at enhancing how to do that. I think one of the things we're missing a trick on is augmentation of small populations. The idea that we've got all these lovely populations of plants out in the landscape, and we've got our own favourites. One of my favourites is the button wrinklewort. The button ringwort at St Albans is a population of about, I don't know what it currently stands, but let's call it less than 50 individuals. That's not very many individuals to sort of suggest that that population's got a long-term future. Why wouldn't we augment that population by planting another 250 individuals to give that population some resilience, and it can start functioning like, it can start functioning. This is a really different type of rebuilding, one that we've not talked about very much in the grassland field, I don't think. Paul's introduced restoration of absolutely crapola kind of, grassland or, invaded ecosystems. And that's what we're using for that connectivity process. So I think we've got this bit done. We can rebuild grasslands, but I'm actually putting out a plea to say, but what about the bit next door to Paul's restoration there, which is the really good grassland? What are the species doing in populations in those areas? And if those populations are small, then they're likely to be in decline. And so we need to do both, but augmentation is something we have never thought about. Well, I shouldn't say never. It's something we need to do much, much more about. Burning's great for maintaining populations of species, but that doesn't mean, even despite the fact we've been doing this, that those populations are growing. We've still got to figure out what are the causes of decline of individual populations. So what I'm really saying is, here we are out the front of, or on a roadside grassland, and look at this Thelomitra display. This is a large population. It's going to be sharing lots of pollen. It's probably attracting pollinators. It's got a really good success or potential for success for seed set and future regeneration. One of the reasons is because there's lots and lots and lots of individuals. But if that population gets down to 6, the probability of that population maintaining itself, of course, declines. There's less pollen floating around. There's less seeds being produced. The opportunities for regeneration decline. Ultimately, that species might disappear from that population. And I want to hone in on a particular species we're working on at the moment. I have an honours student, Susan, who's working on this fantastic plant, Tylotus macrocephalus. It's iconic on the grasslands. It's long-lived. You can see the below-ground investment in those woody roots. It's not a tree. It's not a shrub. It's actually a herb, but it invests below ground in persistence. Those fantastic big pussy tail flowers above ground. She's just resurveyed a whole bunch of sites across the Western Plains, and a fair few of them, I haven't got that off the top of my head, the number, have just disappeared. And this is a really iconic species. Like, we should be able to see this. About 80 to 85% of the populations are smaller than 50 individuals. And only 3 populations that she's sampled across the VVP consist of more than 100 individuals. Yet she's probably found something like 35 populations, something like that. So for about 30 populations, they're in very small numbers. And they're not recruiting. They're persisting, not recruiting. There's only 3 sites where we would say there's evidence of ongoing recruitment, and that's because they're big. So if we want to save that that plant there, that mother plant there that's producing seed, once she goes, we lose her genetic identity, so her maternal identity. So I think it's really important that we augment small populations and she can start breeding, maybe successfully. And if we put enough individuals in, we start getting population recruitment. This is an iconic species that's disappearing. My goodness, what's happening to species for which we know nothing about? So again, coming back to Ben Zeman, during his PhD, he surveyed a whole bunch of sites across the VVP and just compared species lists from the 1980s, mid-80s to early 90s, I think, all the way through to the mid-2010s. And unfortunately, he found that 65% of native species, so that would be about 150 species out of that 234, were in decline. So this is the future we're facing. We might be trying to restore some areas, but the remnant populations are in decline. So I think there's a real great opportunity to halt or reverse that. And it may well be through augmentation. Now, why is this? I just want to introduce one piece of science here for you. It's called the Ali effect. It's the capacity of a population to maintain itself at small population size versus high population size. So we might call that growth rate. A positive growth rate would mean that it's producing seed, it's producing seedlings, they're producing offspring. You know, they're maintaining themselves. A negative growth rate means that the adults are not replacing themselves and are basically eroding away over time. So we would expect when populations are in the tens that you've got a negative population growth rate, meaning that you just not got a capacity to draw pollinators in. You haven't got enough individuals to share pollen that's genetically diverse, you know, to produce seed. If you get populations into the many hundreds or even thousands, then we maximize population growth rates, like that beautiful Thalamitra orchid example we just showed. If you've got hundreds, if not thousands of individuals, the probability of you persisting, maintaining a population growth rate is really high. You might ask what's going on when we get to very big populations. Well, populations regulate themselves. If you get so many individuals, at some point, some individuals aren't getting pollinated anymore because there's so many flowers to be pollinated. Or there's so many individuals, they're competing with each other. And so only the stronger ones are surviving. So whilst I don't think of that as a negative thing, that you've got big populations, it's just to demonstrate that at very small populations, growth rates are negative. There's a really important phase where big populations maintain themselves. And if we were lucky enough to have some individual species in the tens of thousands, well, some of the seedlings won't survive simply because they're competing with all the other seedlings. But many of our populations must be in this sort of part of the curve. They're below the line of maintaining population growth. That's what Ben's work tells us. They're in decline. So we need to do something about that. So I'm going to call upon us tonight to think about supplementing small populations. It could be before they go extinct, but yeah, de-extinction before they go extinct. And so we're trying to do this at Truganina Cemetery with my favourite plant, the button wrinklewort. The button wrinklewort at Truganina in very high quality habitat has declined from over 1,000 individuals in the 1990s to about 600 now. So it's declined by 40%. What we're doing is we're going in and we're augmenting some populations with different individuals because, you know, we want to enhance this. And you might say, I don't like what you're doing. We can have that discussion. I'm really interested in trying to maintain that species at that site for as long as we can because it's genetically diverse. The reason it's in decline is because it's not recruiting very well. That might be because it's not getting burnt frequently enough. There's lots of reasons why this might be happening. But the science of augmentation is totally in its infancy. We're not doing it at all. I would love us all to pick a species and say, I'm going to work out how to enhance the population. So that could be how many individuals do you have to put back so that you can get 50% survival after 3 years? Do we have to put back 500? Do we have to put back 200? You know, we don't know anything about this. What sort of density should they go in? Denser is probably better because that means more likelihood of gene transfer, pollen transfer, rather than sparse. What sort of habitat conditions do we have to do this in? Presumably a burnt grassland is going to be more likely to allow species entry into it than an unburnt grassland. So there's some things we've got to work out. But this is what grasslands are going to need. It's not just about enhancement, it's about augmentation. So we get back to seeds. We've got to value seeds in all their shapes and sizes because this is the future of a population, its ability to regenerate. So the small things in grasslands almost become the most important things. So I'm going to conclude here, Adrian. We need champions for grasslands. All of you here tonight, I'm assuming, are probably grassland champions. You're here, you're interested. The Grassy Plains Network is a great forum for us to talk and to exchange ideas and to challenge one another about how to go about doing this. Certainly, we're in a better position than we were 25 years ago. We've protected heaps of grasslands, but despite that, things are still, not going great in many grasslands. So I want us to think much more about enhancement. It's got a long way to go, but I reckon we could make great strides in a short time if we start actively thinking about enhancing small populations. We might start with endangered species, but the principle applies to things that are still common. We've got the technology to restore, so we might want to think about where and what are we putting back. And we've got to support an industry. Now, I know this, Paul Gibson-Roy would bang on about this. We know this, but we've got to keep championing that because without that, we really are going to struggle to maintain some grasslands and some grassland species. And if you haven't cottoned onto it already, we've got to value the small things, the things that basically are the future, these little tiny seeds for which, a handful of seeds might be the future of a species. We've got to use them wisely, though. We can't just throw them out and hope for the best. Maybe we need to develop techniques to maximize the use of that seed in the most positive way. So a couple of last slides. We love grassland diversity. We love all the form and function of grasslands. This is why we're here. We want to see this persist in its natural state rather than, say, in a seed bank in a herbarium. That's the last resort. What we do now, going into the future, will really have the ability to do that. But I just want to remind people, since 1986, 39 new plant species have been discovered on the Victorian volcanic plain. A whole bunch of orchids, a whole bunch of daisies have been named for the first time as entities that are only found on the Victorian volcanic plains. So the fight to save species is actually really worthwhile because we're actually saving species we didn't even know existed. I don't know if there's more species out there to be discovered, but who knows? And I'll leave you with this quote that I found really interesting and inspiring from the new Australian of the Year. I was watching this the other night. And Neil Danaher, the Australian of the Year, said, "When it's all said and done, more is said than done. Do." I think that would be my departing line for you is we can talk and ruminate about this stuff, but I think we've got to get on with the doing because grasslands of all ecosystems in Australia really need a lot to be done. And thanks, Adrian. I'll leave it there. It took a little bit longer than I was going to. Really happy to take questions if anyone's got them. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk again tonight.
Thank you very, very much, John. That was inspiring, to say the least. And it's so fantastic to see such incisive science, I suppose, to allow us to give direction to activities, to our activities. It's I'm sure people have a lot of questions, so throw them in the chat or just yell at John. But by all means, I'm sure it's I might start us off, John. I'm sure this isn't probably the best question to start off with, but I'm just wondering, you were talking about ecosystem functionality and its lack in legislation, and I'm wondering how we'd go about sort of I don't know, measuring or categorizing or comprehending how to put it, what we actually ask to have legislated.
Yeah, no, it's a good question because at the moment we can legislate for threatening processes, deer as a threatening process, we can have threatening processes legislated. The functionality in legislation, I think what I'm really trying to do is get us to think about the context as well. So we can list a species, and I see there's some lovely chat in the box here about Leucochrysum albicans, the white, the hoary sun daisy. I mean, listing it alone is an important thing to do, but listing it into what kind of habitat or into what kind of ecological setting. So thinking about, I guess it's the Tasmanian tiger thing, Adrian. Like, it's great to bring it back, but how? And like it has to be more than just the entity. I think, for me, it's where are the grasslands that it's going to go into? This is the hoary sunray. What are the ecological processes that should be a measure of success? Now, we all know, and I hope there's no one online who's going to take offense at this, but we all know that action statements are written rather generically and don't necessarily lead to actions. I'd like to see this ramped up to think much more about, we're going to recover the hoary sunray, and to do so, we need to ensure that pollination processes are maximised, and we know a little bit about pollination in that species. So that means we need to have grasslands where native bees are still present, rather than the idea of, I guess, dumping them into a car park in Mickleham and saying, there you go, we've recovered the species, and to me, it's like, it's all about context again. So I guess it's my call is that grasslands are about function as much as entities, and function is something that a lot of us haven't thought much about. We've been interested in the entities, and that's fine because we've got to start with saving all the parts, but can the parts then interact and do the things that they need to do? And the pussy tails, the Botulosis macrocephalus example again, we could list that. It probably should be listed under the IUCN as critically endangered, actually, because it's not recruiting, it's actually blinking away. But one of the reasons is because maybe it's got pollinator breakdown. It just can't recruit because it's pollinators. So that we need to understand function to save a species, actually.
Okay. Questions, people? Okay, so here you go. Hugh Koppel has a question. What role do you see seed production areas playing in the restoration and augmentation of grasslands?
Critical. Without them, Hugh, because we need to bulk up numbers. That's the thing. We can't continue to take things off remnants as well. I mean, I think that's actually part of the problem. We're taking all these things off and putting them somewhere else. So seed production, Hugh, is absolutely critical. It needs an investment. And we need to understand, we need to have a really good scientific basis, like a genetic basis for that. Like, what's the optimum number of individuals that get collected from that form the basis of a seed production area? Or do you turn your seed production area over every 3 years? Like, you just pull up all those button wrinkleworts that you had in seed production and start again, so you maintain genetic diversity. One of the issues with seed production areas, you can lose diversity because anyway, you just can. Without seed production, we can't scale any of this up. We can't do connectivity. We can't probably augment populations outside of just a few here and there. So I would say we need to agitate for that. We need funding. We need support. And I was very hopeful rather when the Western Grassland Reserve was announced 20 years ago, with a big bucket of money apparently, that some of that would be put into a seed production facility to recover that land. We still need that. I mean, without it, I don't actually know what the hell the Western Grassland Reserve is about, actually. So absolutely important.
Yeah. So on that, there's another question on provenance. What do you see as the seed provenance genetic considerations when augmenting populations?
Yeah, really good question. Look, I'm moving away. So I actually work now in a field a little bit called genetic rescue. Many of these small populations are small and therefore by definition inbred, because invariably mum is breeding possibly with a daughter or a son or whatever. And we need to and the context is important here. If you've only got 3 pussy tails, Tylotus, in your population, and your nearest population is some distance away, and there's 200 of them for argument's sake, I'd be saying, if we want to conserve that population of 3, and what we're conserving is the maternal line. In plants, it's the mother that is actually the thing you're trying, its line is what you're conserving. So when we talk about provenance and bringing new species in or new individuals, that's actually the pollen donor. It's actually, and so that's creating pollen, that's providing pollen that might be compatible with that plant to produce seed. It's losing the mothers. It's actually the really important thing here, because the mothers are carrying the maternal line. They're carrying the genetic code, as it were, for the next generation. So losing mums I've come to the conclusion, losing mums is way worse than bringing in a provenance of a plant from further away. Ruidosus is a good example. It's now got only 3 populations on the Victorian volcanic plains now. 2 of those populations are less than 40 individuals. And yet, when we do the genetics on them, the St. Albans population is one of the most diverse populations on the planet. It's more diverse than Canberra populations that have 25,000 individuals. There's 40 or 50 individuals at most. If we lose those 40 or 50 individuals, the mums, we actually lose the genetic diversity of that species, if you like. So I've come to the conclusion we need to be a bit more pragmatic here about what are we losing. And many of us have worried about the introduction of new provenance. Happy to talk about that, because that can be what's called outbreeding depression. But losing mums to inbreeding depression is a much, much bigger issue and has been demonstrated. So we need to do a whole workshop on this, Adrian, about that kind of question. But I've come to the conclusion I want to save species first, not necessarily local provenances. The reason for saving the local provenances is because that's where the maternal line is. That's the diversity, is the mums. We need to save the mums. That's where the augmentation becomes important. Anyway.
Okay. Yes, do a workshop, please. Indeed, Megan. Yeah, indeed. Well,
you'll end soon, Adrian, but yeah, I'm happy to take a few more questions.
Yep. Okay. So those two species that you said are still up in the alpine montane
Yep.
areas. The what was it, the Euphrasia and
Scabra, yeah, and the Thesium australe.
Are people reintroducing them into the low?
Been efforts, Adrian. Good question. So down at Mooramong, the National Trust property near Skipton, both of those species were introduced and both ultimately have failed.
Oh.
And that speaks to the idea this is hard. Like, once we lose things, it's actually hard. So I guess my augmentation call is let's try and maintain things that are here before we lose them and get them more likely to persist. So yes, people have tried. The reason it would have been hard, Adrian, is because they're both parasitic, like they're root parasites. And so they've got an added complication of what are they parasitizing, and when you're down to these rare plants with not very many individuals, it's really hard to figure these things out. Euphrasia, the yellow eyebright, is probably parasitizing any herbaceous plant, actually, like with fibrous roots, probably, but we don't know that,
All right. Well, if no one has anything, there are more questions. One more. Okay. What's the biggest change in knowledge and technique since Land of Sweeping Plains?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Yeah. What's the new chapter? What's the?
I think the updating the genetics would be a big one to think about. I didn't really answer your question there, Adrian. Yeah, we know a lot more about genetics now of a bunch of species. It's what we do with that information. The second would be maybe around seed technologies. So they're new and developing. I think they're super exciting, but not used very much yet, like seed pelleting ideas or whatever, where I'm really worried, say, with a rare plant, if we've got only 200 seed of that, what do we do with it? Well, we either grow them in the nursery as 200 individuals, plant them out, or we pre-germinate, little balls of goo, basically, and they're pre-germinated. So we then put them into the field and they have at least an opportunity to germinate and establish in the field rather than just chucking seed, direct seeding, and most of it doesn't go anywhere. We've known that for a long time. So I think seed technologies would be the other thing, but I hope that's going to increase as well. So maybe those two things there, but that's an excellent question. Yeah, all right. And we are updating that book soon, aren't we, Adrian?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah. Oh my God, the work. Okay. Yes. Sounds like a good idea though, John. Let's let you go to dinner, and thank you, and let you ride off into the distance as the knight in grassy armor. And we'll thank you very much for mind-broadening conversation tonight.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks everyone for coming as well. I really appreciate chatting, getting you to think. Happy to chat. If you want to share my email, actually, I'll just put it in the chat box, actually, Adrian. I'm more than happy to try and respond to people within reason.
It's a quiet time of year, John. I'm sure you'll succeed in answering everyone. Yeah.
I will put it in here. If you've got any future follow-up questions, just follow up with me. I can't believe I'm saying this, but anyway, there we go.
Everyone will forgive you if you don't. It's, so yes, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.